Madison Brooks pressed her pencil against the final equation of her advanced calculus exam, her mind calculating derivatives with mechanical precision. The afternoon sun streamed through the third-floor windows of Jefferson High School, casting long shadows across the rows of bent heads and focused faces. 23 minutes remained on the clock, but Madison had already conquered the test that had left her classmates sweating and erasing frantically. She glanced up at Mrs. Patterson, who sat grading papers at her desk with the satisfied smile of a teacher who had crafted the perfect academic torture device. The woman had no idea that Madison had been solving differential equations since she was 12, or that her father had drilled mathematical concepts into her mind during their late-night sessions in his home office sessions that had abruptly ended 6 months ago when he disappeared. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The pencil trembled slightly in Madison's grip as memories threatened to surface. Focus. Just finish the test. Get into MAT. Find answers about Dad later. A shadow flickered past the window. Madison's head snapped up, her mathematician's mind automatically calculating that nothing should be moving at that heightened speed outside a third-floor classroom. The shadow appeared again, larger this time, accompanied by a barely audible whirring sound that made her stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Then the windows exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Black-clad figures rappelled through the destroyed opening with fluid precision, their tactical gear gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Madison's pencil clattered to the floor as she watched 5 Navy SEALs. She recognized the distinctive patches and equipment from her father's old photographs fan out across the classroom with weapons raised. Everyone down, now. The lead SEAL's voice cut through the chaos of screaming students and toppling desks, but his eyes weren't scanning the room randomly. They locked directly onto Madison Brooks, and in that moment, she knew with crystal clarity that this wasn't a training exercise gone wrong or a case of mistaken identity. They had come for her. Mrs. Patterson's scream pierced the air as she scrambled backward, knocking over her coffee mug in a cascade of brown liquid that spread across the graded exams like a map of academic destruction. The other students had dropped to the floor as commanded, but Madison remained frozen in her seat, her mind racing through impossible calculations that didn't add up to any logical conclusion. The lead SEAL stepped forward, lowering his weapon slightly but keeping it ready. Through his tactical goggles, Madison could see eyes the color of winter storms, cold, focused, but not entirely unkind. Madison Brooks? How did he know her name? She opened her mouth to respond, but only a whisper emerged. Yes. I'm Lieutenant Commander Jake Reeves, SEAL Team 6. You need to come with us immediately. Wait, what? I'm in the middle of. Madison gestured weakly at her test, as if completing calculus problems somehow trumped being extracted by elite military personnel. Ma'am, your life is in immediate danger. We have approximately 90 seconds before hostile forces reach this location. Reeves spoke with the crisp efficiency of someone accustomed to life or death situations. We can explain everything once you're secure, but we need to move now. The classroom erupted in whispered panic as students began lifting their heads, phones appearing like mushrooms after rain. Madison caught sight of Tyler Chun aiming his camera at the SEALs, probably already composing the TikTok caption that would make him internet famous. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me what this is about, Madison said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. And why you're terrifying my classmates. Reeves exchanged a glance with the SEAL positioned by the door, a woman with sharp features and calculating eyes who had been monitoring the hallway. Hostile movement, 2 minutes out, she reported in a clipped tone. Listen to me very carefully, Reeves said, moving closer to Madison's desk. Your father wasn't just a mathematics professor, Dr. James. Brooks was one of the most brilliant cryptographers in the country. And before he disappeared, He hid something that multiple international organizations are willing to kill for. They believe you know where it is. Madison's world tilted on its axis. Her father, with his rumpled sweaters and coffee-stained notebooks, a target for international criminals? It was absurd, impossible, and yet the late-night sessions. The complex equations that seemed to have no practical application. The locked filing cabinet in his office that she'd never been allowed to touch. The phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room. "I don't know anything about 60 seconds," the female SEAL announced. Multiple vehicles approaching. From 3 directions, Mrs. Patterson found her voice. "You can't just take one of my students. I'm calling the principal. I'm calling the police." "Ma'am, we are the police," Reeves said grimly. The kind that arrives when regular law enforcement isn't enough. Through the broken windows came the distant sound of car engines and the slam of doors. Madison's enhanced hearing, a trait she'd inherited from her father along with his mathematical gifts, picked up the subtle differences in the approaching footsteps. These weren't school security guards or local police. These were professionals, moving with predatory coordination. "Madison." Reeves extended his gloved hand. "I knew your father. We worked together on classified projects, and he spoke about you constantly. He was proud of your mind, terrified for your safety, and absolutely certain that if anything happened to him, you'd be smart enough to recognize when your life depended on trusting the right people." The sincerity in his voice cut through her fear like a scalpel through skin. Madison looked around the classroom, at her terrified classmates, at Mrs. Patterson fumbling with her phone, at the test she'd been so determined to perfect, and realized that her old life had just ended as abruptly as her father's had begun 6 months ago. "What did he hide?" she asked. "The key to something called the Prometheus Protocol," Reeves said. "And if the wrong people get their hands on it, what happened in this classroom today will look like a birthday party compared to what comes next." Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Madison grabbed her backpack, the weight of her laptop, and the worn notebook she always carried, suddenly feeling significant in ways she couldn't yet understand. "Stay down," Reeves commanded the other students as his team moved into extraction formation. "Nobody follows us, nobody films us leaving, and if anyone asks, you never saw us here." Tyler Chun lowered his phone with obvious reluctance. Madison stood on unsteady legs, her mind automatically cataloging the tactical gear, weaponry, and positioning of the 5 SEALs. Her father had taught her to observe everything, to find patterns in chaos, to solve for X even when the equation seemed impossible. The pattern here was clear. She was X, and everyone was trying to solve for her. "The window?" she asked, looking at the repelling rope still dangling in the afternoon breeze. "Too exposed now. We go through the building." Reeves moved to the door, hand signals coordinating his team with wordless precision. The female SEAL Madison caught sight of Torres. On her name tape took point position while 2 others flanked Madison protectively. The remaining team member covered their rear, weapon trained on the hallway they'd soon be leaving behind. As they prepared to exit the classroom that had contained her entire world just minutes before, Madison caught Mrs. Patterson's eye. The older woman's face showed a mixture of fear and something else, recognition, perhaps, or understanding that this girl had always been different, had always carried herself like someone waiting for a larger destiny to claim her. "Tell my mom." "I'm okay," Madison said softly. Then Lieutenant Commander Jake Reeves opened the classroom door, and Madison Brooks stepped into a world where mathematics meant life or death, where her father's legacy was written in blood and code, and where being the smartest girl in school suddenly meant being the most hunted teenager in America. The hallway stretched before them like a probability equation, with too many variables and not enough time to solve for all of them. But as they moved toward an uncertain future, Madison found herself calculating odds with the cold precision her father had taught her. She was going to survive this. She was going to find answers about her father's disappearance. And she was going to make the people responsible for turning her life upside down pay for every moment of terror they'd inflicted on her classmates. The equation was simple, even if the solution would be anything but the Jefferson High School. Hallway had never felt this long during Madison's 3 years of traversing it between classes. Now flanked by Navy SEALs and moving with purpose toward an exit she'd never considered before, every locker and classroom door seemed to whisper with potential threats. Torres held up a closed fist, freezing the team in place. Through the chaos of Madison's thoughts came the training her father had insisted upon: situational awareness, pattern recognition, the ability to remain calm under pressure. She listened for what had caught the SEAL's attention and heard it. Footsteps approaching from the main stairwell, moving too quickly and too coordinated to be students or faculty. Reeves pressed Madison against the wall beside the chemistry lab, his body shielding her from the corridor intersection ahead. His proximity brought the scent of tactical gear and something else, a cologne that reminded her inexplicably of her father's study, leather-bound books and late-night coffee. Secondary extraction route, he whispered into his throat mic. Package is secure. Package. Madison almost smiled despite the circumstances. Leave it to the military to reduce a 17-year-old honors student to a euphemism. The approaching footsteps multiplied. Madison counted at least 8 individuals, moving with professional spacing and discipline. These weren't local law enforcement responding to reports of broken windows and screaming students. These were the hostile forces Reeves had warned about. And they'd arrived exactly on schedule. Torres hand-signed something Madison didn't understand, but Reeves responded immediately by redirecting them toward the service corridor that led to the building's old fallout shelter, a relic from the Cold War that most students didn't know existed. Madison only knew about it because she'd discovered the architectural plans in the library during a research project about nuclear preparedness in American schools. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now being protected from a different kind of war by knowledge gained through academic curiosity. They slipped into the service corridor just as voices echoed from the main hallway. Madison caught fragments of conversation in accented English, Russian, maybe, or Eastern European. The words were professional, clipped, focused on search patterns and extraction protocols. Her father had been right to be afraid. The question now was whether he'd been smart enough to keep her safe. The service corridor led to a maintenance stairwell that would take them to the basement level. As they descended, Madison's mind wandered to the notebook in her backpack, filled with equations and diagrams her father had shared during their sessions. Problems he'd claimed were purely theoretical, but which now seemed to carry deadly practical applications. Had she been carrying the key to the Prometheus Protocol all along without knowing it? "There's a tunnel system under the school," she whispered to Reeves as they reached the basement level. From the 1950s, designed to connect to the emergency shelter network downtown. Reeves looked at her with new respect. "Show us." Madison led. Then through the maze of basement corridors, past the boiler room and storage areas that smelled of cleaning supplies and forgotten decades. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a false wall that her father had shown her during one of their weekend exploration adventures, back when she'd believed his interest in Cold War infrastructure was merely academic. The wall swung open on well-oiled hinges, revealing a passageway that had been maintained far better than the school's official record suggested. Motion sensors activated LED lighting strips, illuminating a path that stretched into darkness. "Your father prepared for this," Reeves observed as they entered the tunnel. "He prepared for everything," Madison replied, but even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. If he'd been so prepared, so careful, so aware of the dangers surrounding his work, why had he disappeared without a trace? Why had he left her alone to face whatever forces were now hunting her? The tunnel system proved to be extensive, connecting not just to the emergency shelter network, but to utility corridors that ran beneath the entire downtown area. As they moved through passages that hadn't seen foot traffic in decades, Madison found herself thinking about the mathematical concept of multiple solutions, how complex equations could have several correct answers depending on which variables you chose to emphasize. Her father's disappearance was an equation with too many unknown variables. But every step through these tunnels, every revelation about his hidden life and secret preparations, was adding new information to the calculation. The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, their tactical lights cutting through darkness that had swallowed the secrets of generations. Madison stayed close to Reeves, matching his pace and trying to project a confidence she didn't feel above them. Faint sounds suggested that the search had expanded beyond the school. Car engines, radio chatter, the systematic sweep of professionals who had all the time and resources they needed to find one teenage girl. But they were searching in the wrong place, using the wrong methodology. Madison's father had taught her that the most elegant solutions were often the ones that seemed impossibly simple, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of unnecessary complexity. "Where does this connect?" Torres asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Madison consulted her mental map of the city's underground infrastructure, cross-referencing the tunnel system with the utility grids and abandoned construction projects she'd studied during her research phase. Multiple options: the main library, the courthouse, the transit center. But the safest exit is probably the old federal building. It's got its own security protocols and limited access points. "How do you know all this?" one of the other SEALs asked. Madison shrugged, though the gesture was lost in the darkness. "I read a lot, and my dad liked urban exploring." She didn't mention the growing suspicion that her father's urban exploring had been reconnaissance, preparation for exactly this kind of scenario. The man she'd known as a slightly absent-minded mathematics professor was revealing himself to be someone far more complex and considerably more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. The tunnel began to slope upward, indicating their approach to one of the exit points. Madison could feel the weight of the notebook in her backpack, its pages filled with equations that might hold the key to understanding everything that had happened to her father and everything that was about to happen to her. As they climbed toward uncertain safety, she made a decision that would have made her father proud and terrified in equal measure. She was going to stop running. She was going to stop being the package that needed protection. She was going to become the variable that changed the entire equation. The federal building's sub-basement welcomed them with the musty smell of governmental bureaucracy and the distant hum of evac systems working to circulate air through spaces that rarely saw human occupation. Madison oriented herself quickly, her mental map adjusting to their new location as they emerged from the tunnel system into a corridor lined with storage rooms and utility connections. Reeves checked his watch and consulted a device that looked like a cross between a smartphone and a military radio. "Extract team is en route to pick up coordinates." "Ada, 12 minutes. Where are you taking me?" Madison asked, though she was beginning to suspect that the question itself revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of her situation. "Somewhere safe. While we figure out exactly what your father was working on and why multiple international organizations are willing to start a war to get their hands on it." Madison pulled the notebook from her backpack, its familiar weight solid and reassuring in her hands. "Maybe I can help with that." She opened to a page filled with her father's handwriting equations that had seemed purely theoretical when he'd explained them during one of their late-night sessions. Now surrounded by Navy SEALs in the basement of a federal building, the mathematical relationships took on sinister new meaning. The Prometheus Protocol wasn't just a name. It was a description of what the equations could accomplish: the theft of fire from the gods, the acquisition of knowledge that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the world. Her father had been working on something that could break any encryption, crack any code, penetrate any digital security system ever created. And he'd hidden the key in plain sight, disguised as homework assignments and theoretical problems given to his brilliant daughter. Madison stared at the notebook, understanding flooding through her with the terrible clarity of a perfect mathematical proof. She wasn't just carrying the solution to the Prometheus Protocol. She was the solution. The federal building's emergency exit opened onto an alley that had seen better decades, its cracked pavement and rusted dumpsters providing perfect cover for clandestine operations. Madison emerged blinking into afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after their underground journey, her eyes adjusting as she scanned for threats with newly developed paranoia. A black SUV idled at the alley's mouth, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whatever dangers or salvation waited. Inside, Madison's mathematical mind automatically calculated escape routes, sight lines, and probability matrices for various scenarios, training she didn't remember receiving, but somehow possessed nonetheless. "That's our ride," Reeves said, but his hand remained near his weapon. Even he wasn't entirely sure what they might be walking into. The SUV's rear door opened as they approached, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of posture that suggested military background. Despite her civilian clothes, she wore a simple black suit and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national security. "Madison Brooks," the woman said, extending a hand. "I'm Director Sarah Chun, NSA. Your father and I worked together on several projects." Madison hesitated before taking the offered handshake. "You knew my dad?" James was one of the most brilliant minds in cryptographic mathematics. He was also one of the most ethical men I've ever worked with, which is why he disappeared rather than allow his research to be weaponized. The SUV's interior was equipped with communication gear and monitoring equipment that looked like something from a science fiction film. Madison settled into the leather seat across from Director Chun, acutely aware that her normal life was now measured in hours behind her rather than days or weeks ahead. "Tell me about the Prometheus Protocol," Madison said as the vehicle pulled into traffic. Chun studied her with shrewd eyes. "What has your father told you about his work?" "He said it was theoretical. Mathematical problems with no practical application." Madison pulled out her notebook. "But these equations aren't theoretical at all, are they?" Chun took the notebook and flipped through pages filled with complex mathematical relationships, her expression growing more concerned with each calculation. "Your father created a universal key and algorithmic approach that could theoretically crack any encryption system currently in use. Government databases, banking networks, nuclear command protocols, intelligence communications, everything." Madison felt cold despite the SUV's climate control. Everything? Every digital secret in the world could be unlocked with this key. "Which is why your father refused to complete the final calculations, and why he went into hiding when he realized what his research could accomplish in the wrong hands." The implications were staggering. Madison's homework assignments hadn't been academic exercises, they'd been components of the most dangerous cryptographic tool ever conceived. Her father had been using their study sessions to develop and refine mathematics that could destabilize global security. "How many people know about this?" she asked. "Too many," Reeves answered from the front passenger seat. "Russian intelligence services, Chinese cyber warfare units, North Korean hackers, and at least 3 international criminal organizations, plus various elements within our own government who aren't necessarily aligned with the national interest." Madison processed this information with the clinical detachment her father had taught her to apply to complex problems. "So I'm not just being hunted by foreign agents. Some of the people trying to capture me work for the same government that's supposed to protect me." Chun nodded grimly. "Which is why we're operating outside normal channels. The team protecting you reports directly to me, and I report to exactly 3 people in Washington who can be trusted with information this sensitive." The SUV turned onto a highway leading out of the city, and Madison watched familiar landmarks disappear in the rear window. Her house, her school, her mother, everything that had defined her existence for 17 years was being left behind because her father had taught her to solve equations that could reshape the world's power structure. Where is my father? Madison asked the question she'd been avoiding since the moment the seals crashed through her classroom window. Chun and Reeves exchanged a look that contained volumes of classified information and operational complexity. "We don't know," Chen said finally, "but we're hoping you can help us find him." Madison stared at her notebook, its pages filled with mathematical relationships that had seemed so pure and elegant during their late-night sessions. Mathematics was supposed to be universal truth, clean and precise, and free from the messy complications of human motivation and political ambition. But her father had shown her that even mathematics could be weaponized, that universal truths could become universal threats depending on who controlled their application. The equation was becoming clearer, even if the solution remained elusive. Her father hadn't just hidden the Prometheus Protocol, he'd encoded it in his daughter's mind, trusting that her mathematical gifts and ethical foundation would keep it safe until the right moment arrived to use it. The question now was whether that moment had arrived, or whether she was about to become the variable that tipped the world's balance toward chaos. As the SUV carried her toward an uncertain future, Madison began calculating the odds of survival, the probability of finding her father, and the mathematical certainty that her old life was over forever. The numbers weren't encouraging, but they weren't impossible either. And Madison Brooks had built her entire identity around solving impossible problems. It was time to prove that some equations were worth the risk of solving. The safe house sat on 40 acres of Virginia countryside, its colonial facade hiding security measures that would have impressed her father's paranoid tendencies. Madison counted at least 6 surveillance cameras during their approach, and she suspected that number represented only the ones she was meant to see. Director Chin led her through a foyer that looked like something from a historical preservation magazine, complete with period furniture and family portraits of people who had probably never existed. The illusion of normalcy was so complete that Madison almost expected to hear a television playing somewhere in the background. "Your room is upstairs," Chun said, gesturing toward a staircase that looked original to the colonial period, but probably contained enough hidden technology to monitor her heartbeat from 3 floors away. "You'll find clothes, personal items, and everything you need to be comfortable." Madison paused at the bottom of the stairs. "For how long?" "Until we figure out what your father was really planning, and whether the Prometheus Protocol can be contained or destroyed." The bedroom was spacious and well-appointed, with windows that offered views of rolling hills and the kind of pastoral scenery that suggested peace and security. Madison wasn't fooled. The glass was bulletproof, the window frames contained sensors, and the scenic view was probably monitored by enough firepower to repel a small army. She set her notebook on the antique desk and opened to the first page. Her father had shared with her 6 months ago. The equations looked different now, weighted with implications she was only beginning to understand. What had seemed like elegant mathematical relationships during their study sessions now appeared as components of a digital weapon capable of destabilizing civilization. A soft knock interrupted her analysis. Madison looked up to see a young woman about her own age standing in the doorway, wearing jeans and a sweater that managed to look both casual and expensive. "I'm Alexandra Chun," the girl said with a slight accent that suggested international education. "Director Chun is my mother." Madison studied her unexpected visitor. Alexandra had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and authoritative bearing, but she moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to living in multiple worlds. "You don't look like an SA." "I'm not. I'm a senior at Georgetown, majoring in international relations and computer science." Alexandra entered the room uninvited and settled into the chair by the window. But I've been briefed on your situation, and Mom thought you might appreciate having someone your own age to talk to. About what? The fact that my father turned me into a walking cryptographic weapon without bothering to mention it. Alexandra smiled with genuine sympathy. Actually, about the fact that having a parent in the intelligence community means your normal life was always going to be temporary. The question is what you want to do with the extraordinary life that's replacing it. Madison closed her notebook and turned to face her visitor fully. What would you do? Honestly, I'd be terrified, but I'd also be fascinated. Alexandra leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who had grown up around classified information and international intrigue. Your father created something that could reshape global power structures. That's not just dangerous, it's historically significant. It's also why I'm hiding in a safe house instead of taking my SATs next month. The SATs are designed to measure your ability to succeed in college, Alexandra said. But you're already operating at a level that most college professors never reach. Your father saw your potential and prepared you for challenges that extend far beyond anything a standardized test could measure. Madison walked to the window and stared out at the Virginia countryside, her mind working through the implications of her situation with mathematical precision. You think I should embrace this? I think you should decide what you want your life to mean, Alexandra replied. You could spend the rest of your existence hiding from the consequences of your father's work, or you could take control of it and use it to make the world safer. Or I could accidentally destabilize international relations and trigger a cyber warfare apocalypse. That's also possible, Alexandra admitted cheerfully. But mathematical geniuses don't usually achieve historical significance by playing it safe. Madison turned back to her notebook, seeing the equations with fresh perspective. Her father had indeed prepared her for something extraordinary, not just to understand the Prometheus Protocol, but to decide what should happen to it. The mathematical relationships weren't just tools for breaking encryption. They were a test of character disguised as homework assignments. How much do you know about what happened to my father? Madison asked. Alexandra's expression grew serious. The official version is that he disappeared while working on classified research. The unofficial version is more complicated. Tell me the unofficial version. Alexandra glanced toward the doorway, then moved closer to Madison. There were signs that he was planning his disappearance months in advance. Bank accounts emptied gradually, research notes copied to secure locations, and arrangements made for contingencies that suggested he knew exactly what kind of danger he was facing. Madison felt a spark of hope. You think he's still alive? I think your father is too smart to die accidentally and too careful to die unprepared. Alexandra opened Madison's notebook to a page filled with particularly complex equations. And I think these calculations contain more than just cryptographic keys. They're breadcrumbs. Madison stared at the familiar equations with new understanding. Her father hadn't just been teaching her mathematics. He'd been creating a trail that only she could follow, a path encoded in mathematical relationships that would lead her to him when the time was right, but following that path would require her to fully embrace the dangerous legacy he'd left behind. To become not just the keeper of the Prometheus Protocol, but its active controller. The equation was becoming clear. She could remain safe and powerless, or she could become powerful and perpetually hunted. Mathematics had taught her that some problems had no perfect solutions, only optimal ones given the constraints of the system. Madison Brooks was about to become a constraint that changed the entire system. Dinner at the safe house was served in a dining room that maintained the colonial illusion while accommodating modern security requirements. Madison found herself seated across from Director Chun, with Alexandra to her right and Lieutenant Commander Reeves to her left. The domestic normalcy felt surreal given the circumstances that had brought them together. Tell me about the other players, Madison said as she picked at her meal. The people who are hunting me. Director Chun set down her fork and shifted into briefing mode. The Russians have a cyber warfare division called the GRU Unit 26165. They're led by a man named Viktor Kozlov, who specializes in acquiring advanced cryptographic tools through any means necessary, including kidnapping American high school students. Kozlov once orchestrated the disappearance of an entire research team in Estonia. A 17-year-old girl with valuable knowledge would be considered a minor challenge for his organization. Madison absorbed this information with the clinical detachment her father had taught her. What about the Chinese? Ministry of State Security has a unit dedicated to mathematical cryptography. They're more subtle than the Russians, but potentially more dangerous because they think in longer-term strategic frameworks. Reeves took over the briefing. Then you have the North Koreans who want the protocol to break international financial systems. 3 different criminal organizations who plan to sell it to the highest bidder. And various elements within our own intelligence community who believe American interests would be best served by weaponizing your father's research. Weaponizing it how? Director Chun and Reeves exchanged one of their loaded glances before Chun answered. The Prometheus Protocol could give the United States unilateral access to every encrypted communication system in the world. Government secrets, military plans, financial transactions, personal messages, everything would become transparent to whoever controls the key. Madison set down her fork, her appetite disappearing as the full implications became clear. Total information. Dominance. The ultimate intelligence advantage, Chun confirmed. Which is why some people in Washington see your father's disappearance as treason rather than ethical caution. Alexandra leaned forward, but total transparency works both ways. If every encryption system can be broken, then every secret becomes vulnerable to everyone who possesses the key. It's not just American intelligence that would gain access, it's everyone who could steal, copy, or reverse engineer the protocol. Madison's mathematical mind began working through the cascading implications. Universal transparency would destabilize every power structure based on information asymmetry. Governments, corporations, military organizations, intelligence agencies, everything would become vulnerable to anyone with sufficient mathematical sophistication. Which is why your father chose to disappear rather than complete his research. Reeves said. He recognized that some knowledge is too dangerous to exist. Madison stared at her notebook, which had been placed beside her plate like some kind of mathematical appetizer. But the knowledge does exist. It's sitting right here, disguised as homework assignments and theoretical problems. Incomplete knowledge, Chun corrected. Your father shared components of the protocol with you, but not the final calculations. That would make it operational. Those are still missing. Madison opened the notebook to a page near the end, where her father's handwriting became more hurried and the equations more complex. She'd never been able to follow these particular calculations during their study sessions, and he'd always changed the subject when she asked about them. Now she understood why. These weren't homework assignments, they were the final components of a weapon that could reshape civilization. What if I could complete them? She asked quietly. The dining room fell silent. Director Chun, Alexandra, and Reeves all stared at her with expressions that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. Could you? Chun asked. Madison traced her finger along one of the incomplete equations, her mind automatically filling in the mathematical relationships her father had left unfinished. The patterns were elegant and terrifying, like watching a beautiful flower bloom into something poisonous. Maybe, she said. But should I? It was Alexandra who answered. That depends on whether you want to find your father or spend the rest of your life hiding from the people who are hunting you both. Madison closed the notebook and looked around the table at the faces of people who had become her unlikely allies in a war she was only beginning to understand. Each of them was gambling their career, their safety, and their future on the belief that a 17-year-old girl could solve problems that had confounded the world's intelligence agencies. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clearer, but the ethical equation remained frustratingly complex. Her father had taught her that the most elegant solutions were often the most dangerous ones, and that the price of knowledge sometimes exceeded its value. But he'd also taught her that some problems couldn't be solved by avoiding them only by facing them with sufficient courage and mathematical precision. Madison Brooks was about to discover whether she possessed both qualities in equal measure. "I need to see my father's office," she said. "The real one, not the one at the university. I need to understand what he was really working on before I decide whether to finish it." Director Chun smiled with an expression that mixed pride and concern. "I was hoping you'd say that." The decision had been made. Madison was no longer just a package to be protected or a problem to be contained. She was an active participant in a global equation that would determine the future of digital security, international power structures, and the very nature of privacy in the modern world. The mathematics were about to become deadly serious. Dr. James Brooks' real office occupied the entire basement level of a nondescript building in Arlington, Virginia, its existence hidden beneath the corporate headquarters of a consulting firm that specialized in mathematical modeling for defense contractors. Madison followed Director Chun through security checkpoints that verified their identities through biometric scanners, voice recognition software, and retinal imaging systems. "Your father was given unlimited resources and complete autonomy," Chun explained as they descended in an elevator that required 2 different keycards to operate. "The only requirement was that his research remain compartmentalized and that he report his progress exclusively to me." The elevator doors opened onto a corridor that looked like something from a science fiction film, all clean lines and subtle lighting that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Madison counted 6 different security cameras during their walk to her father's office, and she suspected the number was deliberately conservative. The office itself was exactly what Madison had expected, and nothing like what she'd prepared herself to see. Her father's familiar chaos was evident everywhere: books stacked precariously on every available surface, whiteboards covered with equations that seemed to evolve mid-calculation, coffee mugs in various stages of abandonment throughout the room. But the chaos was underlaid with a level of sophistication that made her university office look like amateur hour. Multiple computer systems hummed quietly in temperature-controlled cabinets, their displays showing complex mathematical models that updated in real time. The walls were covered with printouts of equations that seemed to flow from one whiteboard to the next like chapters in an unfinished mathematical novel. Madison approached her father's main workstation, its 3 large monitors still displaying the last calculations he'd been working on before his disappearance. The equations were familiar variations on the themes they'd explored during their late-night sessions, but these were implemented with a level of complexity that took her breath away. "He was so close," she whispered, tracing patterns in the mathematical relationships with her finger. These calculations would actually work. Director Chun moved to stand beside her. "Close to what?" "To creating a universal decryption key that could adapt to any encryption system automatically." Madison's mind raced through the implications of what she was seeing. Most cryptographic attacks require knowing something about the target system key: length, algorithm type, implementation details. But this approach would learn those characteristics through mathematical analysis of encrypted data itself. Alexandra joined them at the workstation, her computer science background allowing her to follow Madison's explanation. It would be like having a lockpick that could automatically reshape itself to open any lock it encountered. Exactly. Madison opened her notebook and compared her father's homework assignments to the advanced calculations on his monitors. He was using our study sessions to test simplified versions of these algorithms. making sure the mathematical foundations were solid before implementing them at this level of complexity. Reeves examined the security setup around the workstation. Why didn't he complete the research? According to the timestamps, he was working on these calculations right up until the day he disappeared. Madison studied the final equation on the center monitor, her mathematical intuition telling her that something was deliberately incomplete. Her father had been perhaps 30 minutes of calculation away from a breakthrough that would have changed the balance of global power forever. Because he realized what I'm realizing now, she said quietly. This isn't just a cryptographic tool. It's a mathematical weapon that could destroy the concept of digital privacy forever. She moved to a whiteboard covered with equations that seemed more philosophical than practical, dealing with concepts like information theory, ethical mathematics, and the social implications of universal transparency. Her father hadn't just been working on the technical aspects of the Prometheus Protocol, he'd been struggling with its moral dimensions. He was trying to solve an impossible equation, Madison continued, her voice growing stronger as understanding flooded through her. How do you create a tool powerful enough to protect national security without making it so powerful that it destroys the foundations of democratic society? Director Chun frowned. I'm not following the connection. Madison turned to face the group, her notebook open to a page filled with her father's most complex theoretical work. Democracy depends on the ability of individuals to maintain some degree of privacy from government surveillance. But the Prometheus Protocol would eliminate that privacy completely and permanently. Every encrypted communication, every secure transaction, every protected database, everything would become transparent to whoever controlled the key. That's not necessarily a bad thing, Reeves said. Think about how many criminal organizations, terrorist cells, and hostile foreign governments depend on encrypted communications to coordinate their activities. And think about how many journalists, political dissidents, civil rights activists, and ordinary citizens depend on encryption to protect themselves from authoritarian surveillance, Alexandra countered. Total transparency is just another term for total control. Madison walked to another whiteboard where her father had been working on what appeared to be mathematical models for social stability under conditions of universal information transparency. The calculations were incredibly sophisticated, taking into account variables like economic disruption, political upheaval, and psychological adaptation to permanent surveillance. This is why he disappeared, she said with sudden certainty. He figured out that the Prometheus Protocol couldn't be contained or controlled once it was deployed. It would fundamentally alter human society in ways that no one could predict or manage. She found a folder on her father's desk labeled Contingency Analysis and opened it to reveal hundreds of pages of research on historical precedents, psychological studies, and game theory applications related to information transparency. Her father had been thinking far beyond the technical aspects of his research. He'd been modeling the civilizational implications of his work. He wasn't just a cryptographer, Madison realized. He was trying to be a responsible one. Director Chun examined the contents of the folder with growing concern. These analyses suggest that deploying the Prometheus Protocol would destabilize every major government, crash the global financial system, and trigger a cascade of social upheaval. That could take decades to resolve. But not deploying it means leaving American national security vulnerable to adversaries who might develop similar capabilities independently, Reeves pointed out. Madison closed the folder and looked around her father's office with new understanding. Every equation, every model, every theoretical framework represented his attempt to find a solution to an impossible problem: how to protect his country without destroying the world. That's why he encoded the final calculations in my education, she said. He couldn't make this decision alone, and he couldn't trust it to any government or organization. So he created a mathematical heir who would have to solve the ethical equation for herself. The office fell silent as the implications of Madison's revelation settled over them. James Brooks hadn't just disappeared to protect his research. He'd engineered his daughter's mathematical education to ensure that the most dangerous knowledge in history would ultimately be controlled by someone with both the technical ability and moral foundation to use it responsibly. But the question remained, what constituted responsible use of a tool that could reshape human civilization? Madison opened her notebook to the final page of incomplete equations, her mind already beginning to fill in the mathematical relationships her father had left unfinished. The patterns were elegant, terrifying, and surprisingly straightforward. Once she understood their underlying logic, she could complete the Prometheus Protocol in a matter of hours. The question was whether she should. "I need to think," she said, closing the notebook. "And I need to understand what happened to my father before I decide what to do with his legacy." Director Chun nodded. "We'll give you access to everything. We know about his disappearance. But Madison, you need to understand that other people are working on similar research. If you don't complete the Prometheus Protocol, someone else eventually will, probably someone without your father's ethical concerns or your mathematical precision." Madison looked around the office one more time, seeing it now as a monument to one man's struggle with the burden of dangerous knowledge. Her father had spent months trying to solve an equation with no perfect answer, and ultimately he'd chosen to pass that equation to his daughter. The mathematics were becoming clear, but the solution remained frustratingly complex. Some problems, Madison was learning, couldn't be solved with numbers alone. Madison spent the night in her father's office, surrounded by the mathematical legacy of a man who had tried to solve the unsolvable. She'd found a cot in the adjacent rest area. Apparently her father had spent many nights here during the final months of his research, and settled in among equations that seemed to whisper with dangerous possibilities. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams where mathematical symbols chased her through endless corridors, while voices in multiple languages called her name. She woke at dawn with the absolute certainty that someone was watching her, but the office's security system showed no signs of breach. The certainty persisted as she examined her father's final calculations with fresh perspective, hidden within the elegant mathematical relationships. She began to see patterns that had nothing to do with cryptography and everything to do with communication. Her father had been trying to send her a message. Madison pulled out her notebook and began cross-referencing her homework assignments with the advanced equations on his workstation. Specific numerical constants appeared repeatedly across both sets of calculations, but they weren't cryptographically significant. They were coordinates, geographic coordinates, to be precise. She grabbed a pen and began extracting the hidden numbers from 17 different equations, her mathematical training allowing her to see patterns that would be invisible to anyone without her specific educational background. The coordinates formed a sequence of locations stretching from Virginia through the Carolinas and into Georgia. Her father had been creating a trail that only she could follow. "Director Chun," Madison called, her voice echoing through the secure facility. Chun appeared within minutes, followed by Alexandra and Reeves. "What have you found?" Madison showed them the extracted coordinates, her excitement building as the pattern became clearer. "He's not just hiding, he's waiting for me to find him." Reeves studied the coordinates with professional interest. "These locations are all within 100 miles of NSA, listening posts, and CIS safe houses. He's staying close to assets he can trust while remaining invisible to anyone who doesn't have the mathematical key to find him." "But why the elaborate hide-and-seek?" Alexandra asked. "If he wanted to stay in contact, why not just use secure communications?" Madison was already working through that equation. Because any communication system can be monitored or compromised. But mathematical relationships hidden in homework assignments? No intelligence agency in the world would think to look for operational intelligence in calculus problems. Director Chun activated her secure communication device. "I'm calling in. Additional security for your extraction team. If we're going to follow this trail, we need to assume that hostile forces have also figured out your father is trying to contact you." "Actually," Madison said, studying the coordinate sequence more carefully, "I think he's been planning this contact for months. Look at the timing intervals between the coordinates. They correspond to the dates of our study sessions. He was creating this trail in real time while teaching me the mathematics I'd need to follow it." The implications were staggering. Dr. James Brooks had been orchestrating his daughter's rescue operation months before his disappearance, embedding operational intelligence in educational materials while simultaneously preparing her mind to understand and utilize the most dangerous cryptographic research in history. But the trail he'd created also meant that Madison would have to leave the safety of the secure facility and venture into territory where hostile forces could be waiting at any coordinate point. "It's a trap," Reeves said flatly. "Your father may have created this trail, but others could be following it too. Every coordinate you visit increases the risk of contact with unfriendly forces." Madison looked at the sequence of locations, her mind automatically calculating travel times, exposure risks, and probability matrices for successful completion of the trail. The mathematics were daunting, but they weren't impossible. "Then we make sure we get there first," she said. Alexandra grinned with anticipation. "Road trip?" "Highly dangerous, potentially fatal road trip through territory controlled by multiple hostile intelligence services," Chun corrected. "But yes, essentially a road trip." Madison closed her notebook, the decision made. Finding her father meant risking her life, but remaining hidden meant allowing the Prometheus Protocol to potentially fall into hands far less ethical than her own. The equation was brutal in its simplicity. Action meant danger. Inaction meant catastrophe. Her father had taught her that some problems could only be solved by accepting calculated risks and trusting in mathematical precision to guide the way through uncertainty. It was time to discover whether his mathematical training had prepared her for the real-world applications of dangerous knowledge. The first coordinate led them to a small town in rural Virginia. Population 847, according to the weathered sign that welcomed visitors to Millfield. Madison sat in the back seat of an armored sedan, studying topographical maps while Reeves drove with the casual alertness of someone accustomed to potentially hostile territory. Director Chun occupied the passenger seat, monitoring communication channels for any indication that their movements had been detected. Alexandra sat beside Madison, her laptop connected to surveillance systems that provided real-time intelligence about the area they were entering. "Your father chose this location carefully," Chun observed as they approached the town center. "Millfield is small enough that strangers are noticed immediately, but it's also located at the intersection of 3 different escape routes and within helicopter range of 2 military installations." Madison studied the coordinate more precisely. "He's not hiding in the town itself. These numbers point to a location about 3 miles north, probably in the forest preserve." The forest preserve proved to be a 2,000-acre tract of protected wilderness that had been donated to the state by a conservation-minded industrialist in the 1940s. Madison's mathematical mind immediately appreciated the defensive advantages. Multiple access points, excellent cover, and enough complexity to confuse anyone trying to track movement through the area. They parked at the main trailhead and began hiking toward the specific coordinates Madison had extracted from her father's equations. Reeves took point position, his weapon concealed but accessible, while Torres, who had joined them for the extraction mission, covered their rear approach. The trail wound through dense woodland that seemed untouched by human activity. But Madison's ENHANCED pattern recognition began picking up subtle signs of recent passage. Broken twigs at precisely the right height for her father's stride, Disturbed leaves arranged in patterns that weren't quite natural, markers that would be invisible to casual observation, but obvious to someone trained to look for them. "He's been here recently," she said, kneeling beside a fallen log that showed signs of being used as a seat. "Within the last week, maybe less." Alexandra checked her GPS coordinates against Madison's calculations. "We're within 50 meters of the target location." They found the cache hidden beneath a carefully camouflaged depression near the base of a massive oak tree. Madison's father had buried a waterproof container that held another notebook, several encrypted data drives, and a letter addressed to his daughter in his distinctive handwriting. Madison opened the letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Madison, if you're reading this, then you've successfully followed the mathematical trail I embedded in your education. I'm proud of your analytical skills, but more importantly, I'm proud of the ethical foundation that brought you this far. The encrypted drives contain my complete research on the Prometheus Protocol, including the final calculations I was unable to complete before my disappearance. You now possess the technical knowledge necessary to create a tool that could reshape human civilization, but knowledge without wisdom is merely danger disguised as progress. Before you decide what to do with this information, you must understand the forces that are hunting us both and the implications of every possible choice you might make. The next coordinate will lead you to someone who can help you understand the broader context of my research. Trust him completely, but remember that even allies have agendas that may not align perfectly with your own. Your mathematical training has prepared you to think in terms of systems and relationships rather than simple cause and effect. Apply that training to the human systems surrounding this technology. Every action creates reactions, every solution generates new problems, and every choice carries consequences that extend far beyond immediate circumstances. I love you, and I believe in your ability to find solutions I was unable to discover." Your father. Madison read the letter twice, her mind automatically analyzing her father's word choices and implications for hidden messages. He was alive, he was still actively planning their reunion, and he was preparing her for decisions that would extend far beyond personal or family concerns. "The next coordinate?" Alexandra asked. Madison consulted the notebook she'd found in the cache, cross-referencing the new equations with her existing calculations. "North Carolina, about 200 miles from here." Director Chun activated her communication device. "We need to assume our location is compromised. This cache could be monitored, and your father's trail might be leading us into contact with hostile forces." Reeves was already scanning the surrounding forest with professional paranoia. Multiple vehicle approaches from the access road. At least 6 individuals moving with tactical coordination. Madison grabbed the notebook and encrypted drives, stuffing them into her backpack as the sound of engines grew louder. Her father's trail was indeed being followed, but not just by friendly forces. "How long until they reach our position?" Shun asked. 4 minutes, maybe less." Torres had taken a defensive position behind the oak tree, her weapon trained on the approach routes. "We need to move now." Madison looked at the cache, at the letter from her father, at the forest that had seemed so peaceful just moments before. Her mathematical mind began calculating escape routes, probability matrices, and tactical advantages with the cold precision her father had taught her. But underlying the mathematical analysis was a growing realization that every step along her father's trail was simultaneously a step deeper into danger. The people hunting her weren't just seeking the Prometheus Protocol. They were willing to kill for it. The equation was becoming deadly serious, and Madison Brooks was about to discover whether her mathematical training had prepared her to survive. In a world where knowledge was literally a matter of life and death. "This way," she said, leading them deeper into the forest along a deer trail that would provide cover while maintaining access to multiple escape routes. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer. The second coordinate led them to a farmhouse. In rural North Carolina, that looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting, white clapboard siding, wraparound porch, and fields of corn stretching toward distant mountains. But Madison's pattern recognition immediately picked up details that suggested the bucolic appearance was carefully constructed. Camouflage. The power lines leading to the house were heavier than necessary for rural residential use. The windows were slightly thicker than standard glass. The barn in the distance showed signs of modification that had nothing to do with agricultural purposes. Safe house, Reeves confirmed as they approached along a gravel driveway that had been designed to provide clear sight lines in all directions. NSA or CIA, probably both. A man emerged from the farmhouse as they parked. 60s, gray hair, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that didn't quite conceal the shoulder holster underneath. Madison recognized him immediately from photographs in her father's study. "Dr. Michael Harrison," she said. "You worked with my father on classified projects." Harrison smiled with genuine warmth. "Madison, you've grown up since the last time I saw you. That was what, 5 years ago? You were obsessed with prime number sequences and convinced that mathematics could solve any problem in the universe." "I'm less optimistic about that now," Madison replied as they climbed the porch steps. The farmhouse interior maintained its rural facade while accommodating sophisticated communication and security equipment. Harrison led them to a sitting room that managed to look both homey and operational, with comfortable furniture arranged around monitoring stations that could have come from a military command center. "Your father asked me to contact him when you found the second coordinate," Harrison said, settling into a chair that faced multiple escape routes. "He's been tracking your progress through the trail he created." Madison felt a surge of hope and frustration in equal measure. "He's been watching me follow his breadcrumbs while people are trying to kill me. He's been making sure you develop the analytical skills and ethical framework necessary to make the right decision about his research," Harrison corrected. "The trail you've been following isn't just about reunion, it's about education." Director Chun leaned forward with professional interest. "Education about what?" Harrison activated a wall-mounted display that showed a map of the world with dozens of red indicators scattered across multiple continents. "About the fact that at least 12 different organizations are currently working on variations of the Prometheus Protocol. Your father's research is the most advanced, but it's not unique." Madison studied the global distribution of red markers with growing alarm. 12 organizations? Russian military intelligence, Chinese cyber warfare units, North Korean hackers, Israeli cryptographic research, French intelligence services, 3 different international criminal organizations, 2 private military contractors, and at least 2 elements within our own government that operate outside normal oversight. Alexandra whistled softly. "It's like a mathematical arms race." "Exactly," Harrison said. "Which is why your father realized that the question isn't whether the Prometheus Protocol will be developed. It's who will develop it first, and what they'll do with it once they have it." Madison opened her notebook to the final page of incomplete equations, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. "He wants me to finish the research before someone else does, but finish it according to principles he taught me rather than according to political or military objectives. Your father spent 6 months modeling the global implications of universal decryption capabilities," Harrison continued. "Every scenario he analyzed led to the same conclusion. Whoever develops this technology first will have approximately 18 months to implement safeguards and control protocols before other organizations achieve similar capabilities." Madison moved to the map, studying the distribution of red markers and calculating the probability that any of these organizations would prioritize ethical considerations over strategic advantage. The mathematics were depressingly clear. "None of these groups will implement safeguards," she said. "They'll weaponize the technology immediately and worry about consequences later. Which brings us to your father's proposal, Harrison said, activating another display that showed a complex organizational chart. He wants to create a new kind of intelligence organization, one that operates according to mathematical principles, rather than political objectives. Madison studied the organizational structure with fascination and growing concern. Her father's proposal involved creating an international coalition of mathematicians, cryptographers, and computer scientists, who would collectively control the Prometheus Protocol according to principles of transparency, accountability, and global stability. A technocracy, Alexandra said. Rule by experts rather than politicians. Rule by mathematical ethics rather than national interests, Harrison corrected. Your father believes that some technologies are too dangerous to be controlled by any single government or organization. Director Chun frowned. That's essentially advocating for a shadow world government controlled by people with no democratic accountability, as opposed to the current system where the most dangerous technologies are controlled by people with no mathematical accountability. Madison countered. She walked to the window and stared out at the North Carolina countryside, her mind working through the implications of her father's proposal with the analytical rigor he'd taught her. A coalition of mathematical experts could theoretically implement the Prometheus Protocol with appropriate safeguards and ethical oversight. But it would also represent a fundamental shift in how global power structures operated. "Where is my father?" she asked without turning around. Harrison consulted a secure communication device, waiting at the final coordinate. "But Madison, you need to understand that reaching him means committing to his plan. Once you complete the Prometheus Protocol and implement his organizational structure, there's no going back to your normal life." Madison turned to face the group, her notebook clutched in her hands like a mathematical weapon. "There's already no going back. Too many people know what I can do, and too many organizations are competing to control me." She opened the notebook to her father's incomplete equations, her mind automatically beginning to fill in the mathematical relationships that would make the Prometheus Protocol operational. The patterns were elegant and terrifying, representing the culmination of everything her father had taught her about cryptography, mathematics, and ethical responsibility. "I can complete these calculations in about 6 hours," she said. "But I won't do it until I understand exactly what my father is planning and whether his solution is better than the alternatives." Harrison smiled with approval. He said, "You'd say something exactly like that. The final coordinate will provide those answers." Madison looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her unlikely allies in a global conflict she was only beginning to understand. Each of them was gambling their career, their safety, and their future on the belief that a 17-year-old girl could solve problems that had confounded the world's intelligence agencies. The mathematics were becoming clear, but the ethical equation remained frustratingly complex. Her father had taught her that the most elegant solutions were often the most dangerous ones, and that some problems couldn't be solved without fundamentally changing the systems that created them. Madison Brooks was about to discover whether she had the courage to change the world. The final coordinate led them to a location that shouldn't have existed according to any official maps or satellite imagery, a research facility built into the side of a mountain in the Blue Ridge Range. Its existence hidden beneath layers of corporate ownership and classified construction projects that dated back to the early days of the Cold War. Madison studied the facility through binoculars as they approached along a service road that had been designed to discourage casual visitors. The main building was architecturally unremarkable, but the electromagnetic shielding, communication arrays, and defensive positions suggested capabilities that extended far beyond academic research. "Your father has been here for 3 months," Harrison explained as they passed through security checkpoints that verified their identities through multiple biometric systems, working with a team of mathematicians and cryptographers from around the world to implement his proposal for international technological oversight. Madison felt her heart rate accelerate as they entered the facility's main corridor. After 6 months of uncertainty and 6 days of pursuit, she was finally going to see her father again. But the reunion was taking place in a context that suggested their relationship would never again be defined by homework assignments and late-night study sessions. The corridor led to a central chamber that looked like something from a science fiction film. Dozens of computer workstations arranged in concentric circles around a central display area where complex mathematical models rotated in three-dimensional space. Madison counted at least 30 researchers working at various stations, their conversations conducted in the international language of advanced mathematics. And there, at the center of it all, stood her father. Dr. James Brooks looked exactly as Madison remembered him: rumpled sweater, coffee-stained notebooks, hair that suggested frequent encounters with static electricity, but his posture conveyed an authority and purpose that she'd never seen before. This wasn't the absent-minded professor from her memories. This was a man who had found his calling in the intersection of mathematical genius and ethical responsibility. Madison. He looked up from a workstation covered with equations that made her notebook assignments look like elementary arithmetic. "You followed the trail perfectly." Madison ran to him, suddenly feeling like the 17-year-old girl who had been taking a calculus exam just a week ago. Her father's embrace was familiar and comforting, but it couldn't mask the reality that both of their lives had changed irrevocably. "Dad, what is all this?" James Brooks gestured toward the research facility around them. "This is what happens when mathematicians decide to take responsibility for the implications of their work, instead of just publishing papers and hoping someone else worries about the consequences." He led her to the central display where a three-dimensional model showed the global impact of implementing the Prometheus Protocol under various organizational structures. Madison's mathematical training allowed her to follow the complex relationships, but the implications were staggering. "You're modeling the entire world as a mathematical system," she said. "Every government, every intelligence agency, every major corporation, every terrorist organization, all of them, represented as variables in equations that predict how they'll respond to universal decryption capabilities." James pointed to different elements of the model. "Most scenarios lead to chaos, warfare, or authoritarian control. But there are a few solutions that result in increased global stability and protection of individual rights." Madison studied the model with fascination and growing understanding. "You're not just planning to complete the Prometheus Protocol. You're planning to use it to enforce a new kind of global order." "I'm planning to use mathematics to create systems that incentivize cooperation instead of conflict," her father corrected. "The protocol itself is just a tool. The real innovation is using mathematical principles to design international institutions that can't be corrupted or manipulated by political interests." He activated another display that showed the organizational structure Madison had seen at Harrison's farmhouse, but in much greater detail. The proposed system involved mathematical oversight of government activities, algorithmic verification of international agreements, and cryptographic protection for individual privacy rights that couldn't be overridden by political authorities. "It's brilliant," Alexandra said, studying the organizational charts with her background in international relations. "But it's also completely revolutionary. You're talking about replacing human judgment with mathematical algorithms in areas where humanity has always relied on political compromise and cultural negotiation." James Brooks nodded. "Because human judgment in these areas has led to wars, oppression, surveillance states, and the concentration of power in the hands of people who prioritize control over ethics. Mathematics doesn't lie, doesn't compromise principles for political advantage, and doesn't implement double standards based on nationality or economic interests." Madison walked around the central display, her mind working through the implications of her father's proposal with the analytical rigor he'd taught Her. The mathematical elegance was undeniable, but so were the potential dangers of replacing human institutions with algorithmic ones. What about democracy? She asked. What happens to the principle of self-governance when important decisions are made by mathematical models instead of elected representatives? It was Director Chun who answered. That depends on whether you believe current democratic systems are actually responsive to public interests or whether they've been captured by special interests that use democratic rhetoric to justify authoritarian policies. Madison looked around the research facility at 30 of the world's most brilliant mathematicians, working to solve problems that extended far beyond technical challenges. Her father hadn't just disappeared to protect his research, he'd assembled a team to implement a solution that would fundamentally alter the relationship between individual rights and institutional power. You want me to complete the Prometheus Protocol so you can use it to enforce this new system, she said. I want you to understand what the alternatives are, her father replied, and then make your own decision about whether mathematical ethics represent an improvement over political ethics. Madison opened her notebook to the final page of incomplete equations, seeing them now as more than cryptographic tools or academic exercises. These mathematical relationships represented the key to a transformation that would either save human civilization or destroy the foundations of democratic society. The equation was becoming clear, but the solution remained terrifyingly complex. Her father had taught her to think in terms of systems and relationships rather than simple cause and effect. Now she had to apply that thinking to the most important decision in human history. Mathematics was about to become the language of revolution. Madison spent 3 days at the research facility, immersing herself in her father's work while grappling with decisions that extended far beyond personal or family concerns. The 30 mathematicians had become her teachers, colleagues, and fellow conspirators in a plan to reshape human civilization through the application of mathematical principles to global governance. But on the morning of the 4th day, everything changed. Madison was working through the final calculations of the Prometheus Protocol when alarms began echoing through the facility's corridors. Harrison's voice crackled over the intercom system. All personnel to secure positions. We have multiple hostile approaches from 3 different directions. Through the facility's reinforced windows, Madison could see black vehicles approaching along access roads that were supposed to be secret. Helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, their rotors cutting through the morning air with ominous precision. How did they find us? Director Chun asked, activating communication systems that connected the facility to backup military installations. James Brooks was already moving toward a console that controlled the facility's defensive systems. Because someone wanted them to find us. Madison felt cold realization flooding through her as she understood the implication. Someone on the inside. Her father nodded grimly. The Prometheus Protocol represents too much power for any single organization to ignore, including ours. Torres appeared at Madison's side, her weapon ready and her expression focused on immediate tactical concerns. Multiple breach points, at least 40 hostiles with military-grade equipment. We need to evacuate now. But evacuation wasn't going to be simple. The facility had been designed with security in mind, but it had also been designed around the assumption that its location would remain secret. Now that assumption had been compromised. Their fortress had become their trap. The research one of the mathematicians called out, "We can't let them access the servers." James Brooks was already implementing a protocol that Madison recognized from their theoretical discussions. Automatic data destruction initiates in 15 minutes. Everything we've worked on will be wiped clean. Including the Prometheus Protocol? Madison asked. Her father looked at her with an expression that mixed pride and desperate hope. Unless you've memorized the final calculations. Madison stared at her notebook, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. Her father's elaborate educational program hadn't just been about teaching her mathematics. It had been about turning her into a living repository for the most dangerous knowledge in human history. She could complete the Prometheus Protocol from memory. She could reconstruct the entire system without any external resources or documentation. Her father had made her into the ultimate backup drive for revolutionary technology. The extraction point is compromised, Reeves reported from his position at a reinforced window. They've got the main access road covered, and there are snipers positioned on the surrounding ridges. Madison's mathematical mind began working through escape probabilities with cold precision. The facility had been designed with multiple exit strategies, but all of them assumed that hostile forces wouldn't have time to establish comprehensive perimeters. "The old mining tunnels," she said suddenly. Harrison looked at her with surprise. "How did you know about those?" "Geological surveys from the 1940s. This mountain was extensively mined before it became a research site." Madison moved to a wall-mounted display and called up historical maps of the area. "There are at least 6 different tunnel systems that connect to the surface at various points within a 2-mile radius." Her father smiled with genuine pride. "That's my daughter. Always thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else." The tunnel system proved to be exactly what Madison had calculated, a network of abandoned mining passages that had been sealed from the main facility but remained structurally sound and navigable. As explosions echoed above them, indicating that hostile forces had begun their assault on the facility, Madison led 31 of the world's most brilliant mathematicians through passages that hadn't seen human occupation in 70 years. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with the kind of geological uncertainty that made every step a calculated risk. But they were also invisible to surface surveillance and provided access to exit points that hostile forces wouldn't have had time to discover and secure. "How long until the data destruction completes?" Alexandra asked as they navigated through a particularly narrow section of tunnel. James Brooks consulted a device that maintained contact with the facility's computer systems. 8 minutes. After that, the only record of our research will exist in Madison's memory. Madison felt the weight of that responsibility settling over her like a mathematical equation with infinite variables and no obvious solution. 30 of the world's most brilliant minds had spent months developing systems that could potentially save human civilization. And now their work existed only in the mind of a 17-year-old girl who was crawling through abandoned mining tunnels while being hunted by international assassins. "No pressure," she muttered. The first exit point emerged in a grove of pine trees approximately 1 mile from the research facility. Madison counted 17 members of their group as they crawled out of the tunnel entrance, blinking in afternoon sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after the underground darkness. Her father was not among them. "Where's Dad?" Madison asked, panic rising in her voice. Harrison looked grim. "He stayed behind to ensure the data destruction completed properly, and to buy us time to reach the secondary extraction point." Madison turned back toward the tunnel entrance, but Torres grabbed her arm. "You can't go back. The entire facility is probably compromised by now, and your father specifically ordered us to get you to safety." "I'm not leaving him." "You're not leaving him," Director Chun said. "You're preserving his life's work and ensuring that the Prometheus Protocol doesn't fall into the wrong hands. That's what he would want you to do." The smoke rising from the research facility painted dark streaks across the Virginia sky as Madison Brooks stood at the edge of the pine grove, her mathematical mind calculating probabilities she didn't want to accept. Her father had stayed behind to ensure the data destruction, and every additional second that passed decreased his chances of survival. "There," Harrison pointed toward a helicopter rising from behind the mountain ridge. "Emergency extraction." "Your father made it out." Madison felt relief flood through her as she recognized the aircraft's NSA markings, but the emotion was quickly replaced by a cold realization about their situation. 17 mathematicians, cryptographers, and intelligence operatives were now scattered across hostile territory, carrying in their collective memory the components of the most dangerous technology ever conceived, and she was the only one who could put all the pieces together. Secondary extraction point is 12 miles north, Torres announced, consulting a GPS device that had been modified with military encryption. But we need to assume all our communication channels are compromised. Madison opened her notebook one final time, staring at the incomplete equations that had defined her life for the past 6 months. Her father's mathematical legacy was elegant, terrifying, and frustratingly unfinished. But as she studied the patterns, she began to see relationships that extended beyond cryptography into areas her father might never have considered. The Prometheus Protocol wasn't just a tool for breaking encryption. It was a mathematical framework for understanding how information flowed through complex systems. And Madison was beginning to realize that the most complex system of all was human society itself. "I need to show you something," she said, gathering the group around a fallen log that would serve as an impromptu conference table. Madison began sketching equations in the dirt with a stick, her movements quick and precise as mathematical relationships took shape in the Virginia soil. The other mathematicians leaned forward with growing interest as they recognized the elegant complexity of what she was creating. "Your father's research focused on cryptographic applications," said Dr. Elena Vasquez, a cybersecurity expert who had been part of the research team. "But these modifications suggest something much broader." Madison nodded, her mind racing through implications that her father might have been too focused to see. The same mathematical principles that can break encryption can also predict social behavior, economic trends, political movements, anything that involves information exchange between multiple parties. Alexandra whistled softly. "You're talking about a tool that could predict the future." "Not predict," Madison corrected. "Model, create probability matrices for complex social systems and identify intervention points where small changes could have large-scale effects." Harrison studied the equations with professional fascination and growing concern. "That's potentially more dangerous than breaking encryption. At least cryptographic attacks only affect digital security. But if you could model social systems with mathematical precision, you could engineer political outcomes, economic collapses, social movements, or international conflicts," Director Chun finished. "It would be the ultimate tool for social control." Madison stared at the equations she'd drawn in the dirt, understanding flooding through her with terrible clarity. Her father had created something far more powerful than a cryptographic weapon. He'd developed the mathematical foundation for controlling human civilization itself, but unlike the cryptographic applications, the social modeling capabilities weren't dependent on completing the Prometheus Protocol. Madison could implement those systems with the mathematical knowledge she already possessed, using techniques her father had taught her during their study sessions without realizing their full implications. The question was whether she should. Sound of approaching helicopters interrupted her calculations. Madison looked up to see aircraft with Russian markings circling their position, their search patterns indicating that the group's location had been compromised. "They've been tracking our movement through the tunnels," Torres said, raising her weapon. "Probably thermal imaging or motion sensors we didn't know about." Madison made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of seeking cover or planning escape routes, she stood up and walked to a clearing where she would be visible to the circling aircraft. "Madison, what are you doing?" Her father's voice crackled through Harrison's communication device. He had reached safety but was monitoring their situation through satellite feeds. "Something you taught me, Dad," Madison called back. "I'm solving for X." She raised her hands in a gesture of surrender, her notebook clutched in her right hand like a mathematical white flag. The Russian helicopters immediately adjusted their flight patterns, focusing on her position while ground teams moved to surround the clearing. "She's lost her mind," Alexandra muttered, but Director Chun held up a hand for silence. "No," Chun said quietly. "She's thinking like her father." The helicopters landed in a coordinated pattern that demonstrated professional military precision. Madison counted 12 armed personnel emerging from the aircraft, all wearing tactical gear that suggested they were prepared for extended operations rather than simple extraction. The team leader approached with his weapon lowered but ready. Madison recognized the type from her father's briefings, Russian GRU, probably Unit 26,165, the same organization that had been hunting her since the classroom extraction. "Madison Brooks," the man said in accented English. "I am Colonel Victor Kozlov. You will come with us." Madison held up her notebook. "I assume you want this." "We want you," Kozlov corrected. "The notebook is merely paper without the mind that can interpret its contents." Madison smiled with an expression that reminded everyone present of her father's confidence when explaining complex mathematical concepts. "Then you should understand that the mind comes with conditions." Kozlov frowned, clearly not accustomed to negotiating with teenage hostages. "You are not in a position to make conditions." "Actually, I'm in the only position that matters," Madison replied. "You need me alive and cooperative to access the Prometheus Protocol, but I don't need you for anything. Which means I have all the leverage in this equation." She opened her notebook to a page filled with the most complex calculations her father had shared, holding it so Kozlov could see the mathematical relationships. "Do you recognize these equations?" Kozlov studied the page with obvious expertise. Despite his military bearing, he was clearly a mathematician himself, probably with advanced degrees in cryptographic analysis. "Components of the decryption algorithm," he said after a moment. "Components," Madison agreed. "But not the complete system. The final calculations exist only in my memory, and they're protected by psychological safeguards my father helped me develop. Try to extract them through interrogation or torture, and the information destroys itself through induced memory fragmentation." It was a bluff, but it was a mathematically sophisticated bluff that played on Kozlov's assumptions about advanced cryptographic research. Madison was gambling that her reputation as a mathematical prodigy would make the claim credible. Kozlov considered her words with professional calculation. "What do you propose?" Madison looked around the clearing at the faces of allies who had become friends, colleagues who had become family, and researchers who had dedicated their lives to ensuring that dangerous knowledge remained in ethical hands. Her father's mathematical legacy was about to be decided by a 17-year-old girl standing in a Virginia forest, surrounded by armed representatives of a hostile foreign government. The equation was becoming clear, and Madison Brooks was finally ready to solve for X. "I propose we stop pretending this is about national interests or military advantages," she said. "The Prometheus Protocol represents a fundamental change in how information security works in the modern world. It's going to be developed by someone, used by someone, and controlled by someone. The question is whether that someone operates according to mathematical principles or political ones." She walked closer to Kozlov, close enough that his soldiers raised their weapons in automatic response. "Your government wants to use this technology to gain advantages over other nations. My government wants to use it for the same purpose. But neither of your governments is thinking about the long-term implications for human society." Madison opened her notebook to the social modeling equations she'd been developing, holding the page so everyone present could see the mathematical relationships. The same principles that can break encryption can also model social systems with unprecedented precision. Implement the Prometheus Protocol without appropriate safeguards, and you don't just gain intelligence advantages, you destabilize the foundations of democratic society. international cooperation, and individual privacy rights. Kozlov studied the equations with growing interest. You are proposing what exactly? I'm proposing that mathematicians control mathematical weapons, Madison said. International cooperation based on shared scientific principles rather than competing political interests. The Prometheus Protocol gets developed according to ethical frameworks that protect individual rights while providing legitimate security benefits to all participating nations. She gestured toward her scattered colleagues, who were watching the negotiation with fascination and terror in equal measure. 30 of the world's most brilliant mathematical minds have spent months developing systems that could implement these safeguards. We can create a framework that makes everyone safer without giving any single government the power to spy on everyone else. Harrison stepped forward, his weapon holstered, but his posture conveying readiness for immediate action. What she's proposing is essentially a mathematical treaty organization. International oversight of cryptographic research with participation. Based on scientific competence rather than political alliances. Alexandra joined the growing circle of negotiation. Like the International Atomic Energy Agency, but for information technology. Shared oversight of dangerous capabilities, with safeguards designed to prevent any single actor from destabilizing the entire system. Kozlov consulted a communication device, speaking rapidly in Russian to someone who was apparently monitoring the situation from a remote location. Madison caught fragments of the conversation words related to mathematical competence, international cooperation, and strategic advantages. My superiors are interested, Kozlov said after several minutes. But they require guarantees that this international organization would not disadvantage Russian interests. It would disadvantage everyone equally, Madison replied. That's the point. No nation gets unilateral access to capabilities that could destabilize all other nations. Everyone operates according to the same mathematical principles, with the same oversight mechanisms and the same ethical constraints. Director Chun activated her communication device, establishing contact with Washington through encrypted channels that had been designed specifically for crisis negotiations. I need authorization to discuss international treaty frameworks with hostile foreign nationals, she said into the device. Madison listened to the fragments of conversation from multiple government representatives, realizing that she had created a situation where mathematical principles were being discussed at the highest levels of international diplomacy. Her father's research had become the foundation for negotiations that could reshape how nations cooperated on advanced technology development. But the negotiations also meant that Madison Brooks, 17-year-old high school student, was being treated as a diplomatic asset whose mathematical knowledge gave her influence over international relations. The equation was becoming more complex than anything her father had ever taught her to solve. 3 hours of negotiation followed, conducted in a Virginia forest clearing while helicopters from multiple nations circled overhead and representatives from the world's major intelligence agencies participated through encrypted communication channels. Madison found herself explaining mathematical concepts to military officials, translating cryptographic principles into diplomatic language, and designing organizational frameworks that could satisfy competing national interests without compromising scientific integrity. The final agreement was elegant in its mathematical precision and revolutionary in its political implications. The Prometheus Protocol would be developed under international oversight, with participation based on scientific competence rather than national affiliation. The resulting organization would operate according to mathematical principles of transparency, accountability, and ethical constraint that couldn't be overridden by political considerations. Most importantly, the organization would be led by Madison Brooks herself, the only person who fully understood both the technical capabilities and ethical implications of her father's research. You realize what you've just agreed to, Her father said when the negotiations concluded and communication had been re-established with the research facility survivors. Madison looked around the clearing at representatives from governments that had been preparing for war over her mathematical knowledge just hours before. Now they were drafting cooperative frameworks based on shared scientific principles and mutual oversight mechanisms. I've agreed to spend the rest of my life making sure that mathematical weapons are controlled by mathematical ethics rather than political expedience, she said. That's not what most 17-year-olds plan for their future careers. Alexandra observed. Madison smiled, feeling older than her years, but more confident than she'd ever been in her mathematical training. Most 17-year-olds don't carry the future of cryptographic security in their homework assignments. 6 months later, the International Mathematical Security Consortium had established headquarters in Geneva, with research facilities in 12 countries and oversight mechanisms that ensured no single government could gain unilateral advantage from advanced cryptographic research. Madison Brooks had become the youngest director of an international organization in history, leading a team of mathematicians whose work was reshaping global approaches to information security. The Prometheus Protocol had been successfully implemented, with safeguards that protected individual privacy rights while providing legitimate security benefits to participating nations. Criminal organizations found their encrypted communications vulnerable to coordinated international efforts, but democratic governments discovered that their surveillance capabilities were constrained by mathematical algorithms that couldn't be overridden by political pressure. Most importantly, Madison had found her father. Dr. James Brooks had emerged from his months of hiding to become the Consortium's chief research officer, working with his daughter to develop mathematical frameworks that extended far beyond cryptography into areas like economic modeling, climate change analysis, and social system optimization. Their late-night study sessions had resumed, but now they were designing solutions to problems that affected the entire human species. "Do you ever miss your old life?" Madison asked during one of their evening conversations in the Geneva facility. Her father looked up from a whiteboard covered with equations that were being used to model refugee migration patterns in response to climate change. "Do you mean, do I miss grading undergraduate calculus exams instead of preventing international conflicts through mathematical optimization?" Madison laughed, realizing that both of their lives had been transformed by equations that started as homework assignments and ended as tools for global cooperation. "When you put it that way, I think we're both doing exactly what we were meant to do." Her father smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had seen his most dangerous knowledge become a foundation for human progress rather than destruction. Mathematics doesn't lie, doesn't compromise principles for political advantage, and doesn't implement double standards based on nationality or economic interests. Madison nodded, understanding finally why her father had chosen to encode the future of human civilization in mathematical relationships rather than political institutions. Some problems can only be solved by people who think in terms of universal truths rather than temporary advantages. The equation had been solved, but the solution had created new problems, new variables, and new opportunities for applying mathematical principles to challenges that extended far beyond cryptography. Madison Brooks had learned that the most important calculations weren't about breaking codes or protecting secrets. They were about building systems that helped human beings cooperate instead of destroying each other. Mathematics had become the language of hope. And that concludes our epic journey through the Prometheus Protocol, a story that took us from a high school calculus exam to the halls of international diplomacy, all through the eyes of one remarkable young woman who discovered that her mathematical gifts came with extraordinary responsibilities. If you've enjoyed this mathematical thriller and Madison's transformation from student to international leader, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with anyone who appreciates intelligent fiction with strong characters and thought-provoking themes. Your engagement helps us continue creating these detailed, novel-length narratives that combine entertainment with ideas worth exploring. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. We have more epic adventures planned, featuring characters who face extraordinary challenges and discover that sometimes the most important equations are the ones that help us understand ourselves and our place in the world. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey through the intersection of mathematics, ethics, and human potential. The story of Madison Brooks reminds us that sometimes the greatest power comes not from what we can control, but from the wisdom to know how that control should be used. Until our next adventure together, keep solving for the variables that matter most.